Today I am speaking with Gertrude Rohland, capital R-O-H-L-A-N-D. It is March 29, 1982. Gertie's parents, Emily Netzel Petke and Edward Petke, came from a part of Germany controlled by Poland and Russia. They settled in Chicago and came to Withee shortly after 1910. Gertie was born in 1917. She is going to tell us about St. John's German Lutheran Church of Withee.
Okay. On February 22nd, 1903, in the village of Withee, Wisconsin, 7 men gathered after Sunday services in the home of William Brandt to create an official congregation to carry on the work of their Lord. Present at that meeting were William Brandt, August Brandt Jr., August Bookert, Ed Nymog, John Schwartz, Frank Heidemann, and the Reverend Adolf Curing, pastor of Zion Lutheran Church of Colby. The Constitution adopted that day begins, "Since, according to God's word, everything in a Christian congregation shall be done in order, we, a number of German Lutherans, have united to form one parish." It further states that the congregation accepts all of the canonical books of the Old and New Testament as God's revealed word, and adheres to all the confessional writings of the Lutheran Church, taken from the Bible and as contained in the Book of Concord, as the rule of faith and conduct. There are the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, the unchanged Augsburg Confession with its apology, the small called articles, Luther's large and small catechisms, and the formula of Concord. William Brandt and Edward Nymog were elected elders that day. August Brandt Jr. as treasurer, and Pastor Curing as secretary. Pastor Curing was extended a call and accepted to serve the Withee congregation once every 4 weeks during the winter months and once every 2 weeks in the summer months. It was at this meeting that the name St. John's was adopted. Without a building of their own, worship services were held, which is presently the Methodist Church. $1 per service was paid for the use of the church building. The Reverend Adolf Curing served St. John's from 1903 to 1904. No written church records are available for the years 1904 to 1907. It is known, however, that the congregation was served by Reverend E. Bunger from the Green Grove Church and Reverend Oswald Lugenheim from the Colby congregation. In 1907, Reverend B.H. Schrein, a student minister, began to serve St. John's. During his ministry here, 1907 to 1912, the parsonage was purchased, and St. John's had its first resident pastor. Pastor Schrein conducted the first confirmation class in 1908. Prior to this, most children were confirmed at the Colby Church. Mrs. Emma Brookert recalled living most of one winter at the Colby parsonage so she could attend classes. Members of the first confirmation class at Withee were Harry Bear, Mabel, Elsie, and John Schwartz. During Pastor Schrein's term of service in Withee, the congregation continued to worship in the Methodist Church building. The Reverend F. Schwertfeger was the second resident pastor, serving from 1912 to 1917. During his tenure, the church building on School Street was erected. The small, extremely poverty-stricken congregation had managed to buy 2 lots north of the parsonage. Sister congregations in Thorpe, Reesburg, and Stanley contributed $300 toward liquidating the debt on the parsonage, thus encouraging Withee members to go forward with the erection of their church building. Pastor Schwertfeger recalled, "The work of collecting and securing pledges of money was up to the pastor and him alone. However, that should not reflect upon the people. In rural congregations, that was common procedure." Mr. Chris Matson, living next to the church property, contracted to build the church for $3,000 if the congregation would dig the foundation. The people managed somehow to raise a little over $1,300. Aid Association for Lutherans loaned the balance of $1,500 at 3% interest. Church records indicate a building committee was appointed consisting of Pastor Schwertfeger, John Schwartz, William Missling, and Henry Petke, and was authorized to draw up plans for the building to measure 32 by 50 feet. At the annual meeting, January 1st, 1914, voters decided to borrow the $1,500 from Aid Association for Lutherans. At this meeting, a rule was adopted. Members pay at least $8 per year for pastor's salary. As 1914 continued, a committee consisting of Fred Flotter, Ed Nymop, and Ed Missling was appointed to purchase the benches. A reed organ held in storage in Burlington, Wisconsin, was gifted to the congregation by a traveling salesman on the condition the freight charge of $6 be paid by the congregation. The first altar and pulpit were a gift from Jehovah Lutheran Church in Chicago, where several families had held membership before moving to Withee. The building was completed and dedicated to the glory of God in September of 1914. Other congregations of the parish were invited, and $200 in gifts was received, enabling the congregation to pay the contractor in full. The envelope system was introduced at this time to encourage members to contribute systematically, and within the year succeeded in paying off on the mortgage. The Reverend Herman Lobbs served 1 year, 1917 to 1918. In February of 1918, St. John's resolved to enter into membership with the Missouri Synod. And in July 1918, at a special meeting, welcomed into membership of St. John's were Ed Frederick, John Rohland, William Lentz, John Engel, Julius Cizik, Fred Malson, Jake Cizik, Karl Bittoff, Fred Schwenke, John Longheim, and Ludwig Schaefer. This group from Chicago had purchased a school building near the John Engel farm with intentions of conducting Polish services there. This group was released from any obligation of church debt retirement, since they had a debt on their own building. And a pastor was invited to come 3 times a year to conduct services in Polish for those not too well acquainted with the German. Somewhere during this period in time, 1917 to 1918 to 1919, there must have been a vacancy, as a pastor, Otto Schreiber, from the Greenwood congregation, serving as vacancy pastor, and he recalled, "One thing I never forgot was the hearty singing at St. John's. When I arrived for the services, the short Petke, there was also a long Petke, my father, would ask for the hymn numbers in the German and the English books. Then he would find them in the Polish language, and post them all. During the singing, it seemed each nationality tried to sing louder than the others. They almost raised the roof with their singing."
I mean, your voice is coming great.
It's coming in through.
Just coming well. Yeah, much better.
It doesn't sound like me.
Well, mine, to me, doesn't sound like me either.
Does that sound like
no,
me to you?
in our head, yes.
Oh.
But to see, in our head, we don't hear the same. Our hearing of us talking isn't the same, they tell me. Because I said to somebody, I said, well, I don't sound like that, do I? Because it sounds just terrible to me.
I would never recognize my voice on that. Never.
No, that's the way.
I'm just wondering if someone hears that, if my family would hear that, they would say, Mom, that's not you, huh?
No, they should hear it the way they hear it. It's we that don't hear our own voice. That's what they tell me. Because I said, my gosh, do I sound that terrible? But my voice is so crackly. There's no getting around that. Well, I shall, let's see now. Okay. And
on July 6th, 1919, St. John's voted to separate from the Thorpe and Reesburg congregation and called their own pastor. Late in 1919, the Reverend Herman Lobbs returned to Withee to remain as resident pastor until 1922. He and my father were very good friends, and I, at age 3 or 4, had a terrific crush on him. I remember it well. At my mother's funeral in 1966, I confessed to him of my feelings. He also confessed he was never aware of it. How crushing. On February 29, 1920, at annual meeting, voters decided to have an English service the first Sunday in each month. May 28, 1922, the Reverend George Grow was installed as pastor. In 1924, St. John's celebrated its 10th anniversary. In July 1925, electricity was installed in the parsonage. In December 1926, Pastor Grow requested and was granted release from St. John's. A Reverend A.C. Staple of Thorpe served as interim pastor with a salary of $30 per month. The parsonage was rented and money applied to church debt. Reverend Staple served from 1927 to 1928. During this time, a Reverend Reuben of Abbotsford served as interim pastor at $30 per month. In February of 1928, a call was extended to and accepted by Pastor Otto Hoffman of Libby, Montana. He served until 1930. In 1928, it was voted to raise $675 for pastor salary, with a request for $525 from the Missouri Mission Board to make up the balance. At this time, it was decided to have Thanksgiving Day services in German as well as English, the Christmas Eve service in English, Christmas Day service in German, and the New Year's Day service in German. Members furnished wood for heating the building. Mr. Fred Brookert was custodian for many years, never complaining, never boasting, never asking payment nor getting any. Bless his soul. A January 1930 report showed total receipts of $1,115.31 for the year. Disbursements figure of $1,063.31. February 23, 1930, a release was given to Reverend Otto Hoffman, who went to serve a Colby congregation. On October 5, 1930, the Reverend E. L. Wendling was ordained and installed at St. John's and remained for 11 years. Reverend Wendling recalled, "These were Depression times. Farmers received 75 cents and less per hundredweight of milk. The pastor was to receive $85 per month, but didn't always get it. Sometimes payment came in the form of meat, vegetables, and other foods. I traveled out to the farms to make my own wood. In 1933, it was decided to reduce the pastor's salary to $550 for the year, and in 1935, a $52 delinquent salary was canceled at the pastor's consent. Permit me a bit of satire. Quote, "And those were the good old days," unquote. In 1935, the youth group purchased another organ for the church. In 1936, church and parsonage were painted, and the church basement got a new cement floor. In May 1938, it was voted to conduct English services every Sunday a.m., with German service every first and third Sunday, immediately following the English. In 1939, St. John's celebrated its 25th anniversary. In 1940, the parsonage received a new roof. After the outbreak of World War II, the congregation voted to give New Testaments to all the boys in the service. In November 1941, Pastor Wendling was given a release to serve another congregation, and Reverend Otto Hoffman served as vacancy pastor until Reverend Walter Schedler arrived in January of 1942. A cold day to be moving into a cold house. Reverend Schedler recalled, "Judith, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roy Alberg, was my first baptismal child, and she was in the last class of confirmands when I left Withee to go to Bear Creek in 1954. In July of 1942, Zion Lutheran Church of Owen became a part of St. John's. Vacation Bible School began in the summer of 1948. Sunday German services were discontinued in 1949. The 50th anniversary of the congregation was observed in May of 1953. Reverend Schrein and Reverend Schwartfeger, both former pastors, and Reverend Clarence Cizik, a son of the congregation, spoke at the celebration. After Reverend Schedler's peaceful release from St. John's, the Reverend Brower of Greenwood filled the vacancy. After a 6-month vacancy, Pastor Theodore Predale was installed. He served from June 19, 1955 until April 1961. During Pastor Predale's term of service, the congregation began to consider an addition to the church building. However, for various reasons, this was never brought to completion. After Reverend Predale left St. John's, experienced a vacancy of more than a year. During this time, the congregation was served first by Reverend Harold Timmerman of Green Grove, and then by Reverend Dan Zilski of Greenwood. The vacancy was highlighted by a spiritual life mission project and the building of a new parsonage across from the church on School Street. In January of 1962, the voters issued a call to Reverend Leroy Ehrman, a graduate of Concordia Theological Seminary of Springfield, Illinois. He was ordained and installed on July 8, 1962. During his interim at St. John's, many activities for teenagers were begun. A parking lot next to the parsonage was established, completion of restrooms in the church, a new bulletin board for the front of the church installed, and the old parsonage, church, and basement of new parsonage were painted. A building committee was appointed to investigate the possibility of a building program. The congregation was become increasingly aware of crowding, lack of Sunday school rooms, parking space, and incensed with an almost overpowering desire to provide a larger and more attractive building for members and the community. And during 1967, after hundreds of hours of meetings, dozens of members of stop me. The congregation was informed of their opinions and plans for a new church building to be located slightly south of the intersection of highways 29 and 73. Finally, many meetings always begun and closed with prayer and with much discussion, many pros and cons, and yes, with many displays of temper, the congregation joined hearts and hands in the task of constructing a new church building. In the very cold early spring of 1968, Reverend Ehrman, the building committee, children of the Sunday school, and representatives of Schubert Construction and Adams Hagman contractors met on the building site for the ground breaking. Almost immediately, the excavations began. Many rains slowed progress and created problems. Still, with almost superhuman strength and surely the help of God, St. John's new house of worship was ready for its dedication on Sunday, November 3rd of 1968. The prayer on that dedication day began, "Gracious and merciful Lord, who hast promised to hear the prayers of thy people, grant unto us the blessing of thine eternal presence in this place. May this house of worship always be a mighty fortress, a house of prayer, a haven of forgiveness, a dispenser of the gospel, a sanctuary. We ask this petition of thee through the merits of Jesus Christ, our Redeemer. Amen." Reverend Ehrman accepted a call to Granite Falls, Minnesota in 1969. Losing my pace again. The Reverend Arthur Hellert came in 1970 and served until 1973. The Reverend Douglas Grunwald became our pastor in September of 1973 and is still serving here. St. John's is very active, with 9 services per month, in addition to Wednesday night Advent and Lenten services. There is a senior citizen Bible class on Tuesday, an adult fellowship meeting once every month, a youth fellowship, a cradle roll, and a very active Sunday school within the area of 150 registered children. God is indeed alive and functioning in the congregation. Changes are always taking place, however. Many new faces and names appear on the church roll, while some no longer walk these aisles. But the bell from the original church continues to call people to worship. Now, available with this tape, not to be removed from the library, is the printed history of St. John's Lutheran Church, published in September of 1964. An account of the dedication service of the new church building south of the village of Withee on Highway 73 on November 3rd, 1968, and a pictorial directory of 1980.